Hey guys, it's me again, Woodcraft CZ. This will be my longest video on YouTube. I'll be talking through how I made my table saw sled. As you can see, I'm putting double-sided tape on these rails that I got from Axminster. The rails are placed on washers so they're slightly elevated, allowing double-sided tape to attach to the body of the sled. The worst thing about this tape is peeling off the backing. Sometimes it feels like it takes forever. Other times it comes off instantly. Okay, so the body of the sled is going onto the rails. I'm using a table saw fence to edge the side of the sled so it gets a rough square. Here I'm using a center finding drill bit to mark out the holes for the rails. I'm now marking the rails to the corresponding sides that they go on. 1 and 1, 2 and 2. The double-sided tape proved to be a little bit too strong, so I'm using a heat gun to just heat the glue up so it loosens the grip on the rails. I'm using a drill guide here so I can get a square 90 degrees hole into the board for the rails to sit. Just going to make sure that the holes accept the screws or the bolts, and I'm also going to countersink them so they're flush to the board. Now time to affix the rails to the board itself. The rails have a threaded insert, so it's just a case of putting the bolts into the thread and tightening. So now time to take it for a test ride. This is where the problems begin. It actually turned out to be a pretty easy fix. I tightened the rails onto the board prior to putting them into the slots, which was a mistake. So I've loosened the bolts, one which I needed to deepen the countersink on, otherwise I just gently tightened them while the rails were in the slots and it fixed the problem. Just going to put a bit of machine wax on the rails just to further ease the gliding effect of the sled. Okay, now time to cut the front fence. This is the fence that sits furthest away from the operator, being myself, when I'm pushing the sled forward. I'm using a shaper origin to cut this out, and I'm just placing the shaper tape onto the board so I can map out a workspace. I used Adobe Illustrator to design a template for the front fence. So now I'm just going to scan in the workspace for the shaper origin so it can map out its coordinates. I'm going to be using the standard 6mm cutter from Shaper Origin. Just measuring the depth and taking note so I know how deep to go with the shaper, and also work out how many passes I will need. I don't know what I was thinking when I was designing the template, but I had done it far too small, so I had to enlarge it on the fly. Fortunately for me, you can do this with the shaper inside the machine. Here's a moment of realization for me. So after a quick re-evaluation, I'm just punching in the new size dimensions and we are good to go. Because it was just the first pass that the small dimensions went over, I knew I could go over it again with the bigger size. As you can see, the new dimensions are far bigger. I really don't know what I was thinking. So this part of the video is just me pretty much going over and over the same template with the shape of origin, cutting deeper and deeper with each pass. The shape of origin does have a function to auto pass, so it will automatically go deeper and deeper when it goes past its starting point. But for the price, I just don't think it's worth it, and it's something I can do manually for free. It's just a little bit more time consuming. Yes, I know what you're thinking, it can get pretty tedious. I tend to go half the cutting bit size, so in this instance it was 6mm, so I cut in passes of 3mm. I've spun the work surface around and added more tape so the shaper can read its new workspace. It has a function to add to the existing workspace, so I don't have to create a new one. As you can see, I'm just rescanning the area and adding it to the existing workspace. Now time to cut. The reason I'm cutting two fences is, as you'll see, I'm going to glue them together just so they're thicker and offer more stability. So during the cut I noticed it was struggling a little bit to cut through. I've not experienced this before when using the shape of origin, so I wanted to have a look at the bit. As you can see, it got burnt. Time for a new bit, I guess. So now I'm just using my Laguna bandsaw to cut the templates out. It has the Resaw King blade on, so it's not great at taking corners, but I'm not a fan of changing blades constantly either. So usually what I do, I just do linear cuts, and if there's going to be a bend, it's going to be a very minute one. As you can see, the bandsaw makes very light work of this. So now that that's done, off to the router table to flush out the edges. The flush trim bit makes light work of these edges. Just using a sanding block here to take any of the rough edges down. Now time to glue these two pieces together. I'm using Titebond quick and thick. I like this because it's got a quicker set time and it's quite thick so it doesn't slide as much. I'm just using some clamps to align it and secure it. Now just smoothing out the edges on the router table. I'm using a different flush trim bit because I don't like gumming up the one I used initially with the glue or potentially not dried glue. So now I'm just marking up and lining up where the front fence is going to sit on the table sled body. Here I'm just lining where I want the screws to go. But before I attach it, I have one more thing to do. I'm going to use the micro jig dovetail system to cut 4 dovetail grooves into the board, 2 vertical and 2 horizontal. The premise here is to use a plunge router bit to cut the initial groove and then the dovetail to finesse it and finish it, ready for the clamp to fit. I think out of all the routers I have, this one by Festool, the OF 1400, is by far my most favourite. It's almost a cross between a small trim router and a larger heavy duty router. So now I'm changing from the plunge router bit to the dovetail micro jig router bit. I'm just setting the final depth for the dovetail bit. Okay, so now that that's done, time to drill the front fence holes. Now I'm just countersinking the holes from the other side. Just clamping the front fence so I can follow through on the pilot holes. Okay, so now time to make the main fence. Setting up the Jessam guide rails to make this job a hell of a lot easier. The back fence will consist of 3 15mm plywood panels. Again, just knocking back the rough edges with the sanding block. Using the same Type Bond quick and thick glue, time to do the fence. This black wrap comes in so handy with glue ups and so many other purposes. Again, using clamps to apply pressure and align the fence. Just using my trusty chisel to take off the glue overspill. So just using my miter saw to square up the edges, and then I'll take it over to the table saw after I've used a sanding block again to take the rough patches down. If you'd like to know more about my Jessam guide setup, there's a YouTube video on my channel that tells you all about it and how I made the anchor points for it. So just using the table saw to joint the edges. Now I'm marking out where the T-slot rail is going to sit. For this, I'm going to use a flat grind saw blade. These saw blades are great because they don't leave little grooves that need to be planed smooth later, like conventional saw blades. I like using the marking knife because it leaves grooves for the pencil to sit in and it's a lot more precise. So just swapping out the blade now for the flat grind blade. It's a lot smaller, but the kerf is a lot thicker. Now just setting the saw blade depth. just using a centering drill bit to do the pilot holes for the screws. Now just screwing down the T-slot rail. So I'm just drilling the pivot point for the fence to go. I'm going to affix it with one screw and then set a rough square. Just using some clamps to prop up the fence while I drill the pilot hole and affix it. Okay, time now to christen the sled with its first cut through centre. I'm taking care not to push the fence by the unsecured side. I'm using a flat rule down the centre of the cut and a carpenter's square to get a rough square angle. I'll be using the 5-cut method to get as close to square as possible. I won't be going into detail on this as there's many YouTube videos out there on this method. I struggle with it myself, so it takes a few watches to really get to understand it. And here's me using the table sled on its maiden voyage. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you like the content I'm producing, please consider leaving a like and even a subscription. It would mean a great deal for me, especially as a new YouTube channel, to increase my followers and audience.